how different people view things like Christianity in Europe than we do over here. And I said, well, no, I don't work for the government. I don't work for a denomination. I don't work for anything. And so she was really struggling with that. She goes, well, don't you collect taxes? And she was still paying taxes. All Danish people do to the parish or the barrio or whatever from the local church that they are in. Now, they don't pay a lot. It's just a little bit each year. And I said, well, why do you pay that? And she goes, well, you need to have some place to be buried. So people are paying tax because if you want a plot to be buried somewhere, the only way to do that is by being buried in the church cemetery, which is basically owned by the state because it's a state church. Welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast. Today, our ongoing study of Galatians and the 7 rules for life. I am Dr. Douglas Peak, and I am your Salty Pastor. And I'm here to help you understand the Bible. Lots of people are checking out the Bible, and if you're one of them, I am honored to help you navigate this thing called the Bible. The Bible is simply a library of 66 different books that have been bound together as one. Now, how am I different than everybody else? Because there's all kinds of people on the internet and all kinds of people in churches everywhere expounding and teaching on the Bible. Well, first and foremost, I'm not trying to convince you of any type of systematic theology or give you some unique and special interpretation. I'm not trying to incorporate you into a denomination or tell you why a specific faith tradition is the only one that is true. I am here to teach you the tools in order for you to read the Bible and understand it for yourself. See if your own life can be transformed when you invest in your faith, because I believe absolutely it will. What the Salty Pastor is all about is a podcast to coach you up in your faith. It's not trying to develop followers. It's not trying to develop a church, a community, or any of those types of things. It's simply to help you in your journey of faith. I have no agenda other than to help you grow. So we're going to jump into the second installment of our series, 7 Rules for Life, a study of the book of Galatians, which is one of the letters that the Apostle Paul wrote to the cities and churches in Galatia that are located in the New Testament books or library. So let's start by discussing rules, right? Because this is titled Rules for Life. There are lots of rules out there, right? There are good rules, bad rules, smart rules, dumb rules. Some people call them principles. Some people call them laws. However, there are some rules or laws or principles that you just can't violate, because if you violate these, your life is set upon a trajectory that will never be the same. It's the old adage that we reap what we sow. Now, it's not just the result of a simple mistaken decision, because we all do that all the time. You have limited information, you make a decision, you think it's a good idea at the time, it turns out to be tragic. All those things can be redeemed, fixed, and life's filled with second, third, fourth, and 100 different chances. So that's just a foregone conclusion. What I'm talking about is, how do you look at growing in your life forward without feeling overwhelmed, burned out, not knowing where to start? Well, one thing I think is perspective, and I call that a frame of reference. And your perspective can start with a simple, I don't know what you would call it, maybe a different idea of looking at things. And let's use a little logic here, okay, and define some terms. Number one is there are rules, right? There's rules out there. And there are principles. Some people use that term. And then other people use the term laws. Now, my question is what is the difference, and why do we use different words for a similar concept? Well, first of all, if there are rules, principles, and laws, under each of those 3 things, you have subcategories, right? And those subcategories help us understand a little bit deeper. So put your thinking cap on and consider this for a moment. When it comes to rules, we have to ask ourselves the question, well, what kind of rules are we talking about? Well, there are relationship rules, right? And then there are office rules at your workplace. The consequences of breaking either of those laws are very different. For example, if you break a relationship rule and you forget your anniversary, well, you're going to pay for it differently than if you break an office rule and get fired. Both of those outcomes may feel similar, but they're dramatically different in their impact in your life. When it comes to laws, for example, it works the exact same way. A law that limits your speed, like a speed limit law, and if you break it, you just get a ticket or a fine. But then there is the law of physics called gravity. And if you break the law of gravity by jumping off a building without a parachute or a bungee rope or a hang glider, guess what? Your life ends. The consequences of breaking those laws are different because the laws are different. Now let's talk principles. And this gives us a little clarity, I think. And that is this. Principles are interesting because they're not so much rules and they're not really a law. Maybe they're kind of like a law, but they are definitely a truth. If you choose to ignore the truth, you reap the one set of consequences. If you live according to the principled truth, you reap an entirely different set of consequences. One bad, the other good. So when you have that kind of framework, you start to understand why Paul wrote this letter to all the churches in the region of Galatia, which is modern day Turkey. So he was concerned about confusion that was created by a group of people who followed after him, and they tried to change the principles, the laws, the rules of a simple faith in Jesus Christ. So that's why he wrote this letter to all of these different churches, is to counteract the influence of this group of people, and they were commonly known as the Judaizers, okay? Now, last week we discussed the first law, and that is in chapter 1, he basically says, never forget your purpose. Never forget the gospel to which you were called, and don't let anybody preach a different gospel. Don't even let me, he says, preach a different gospel to you. Today, we're going to dig into chapter 2 and going to discover the second rule. And the second rule, according to Paul in his letter to the Galatians, is never, ever allow the world to force you into its mold. So let's read chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. And I'm going to read verses 1 through 10. Okay? Then, after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. So what we're thinking here is that he is starting to reference the Council of Jerusalem. And this is recorded in the book of Acts, chapter 15. Side note, one of the reasons why I ask people who are just starting to figure out the Bible to not read it cover to cover or read it from, through in a year, is because you don't understand the framework in which all this other stuff that you're reading happens. That's why I always encourage people, if you're new to the Bible, just read the Gospel according to Luke and then read the book of Acts. Read those two books first. And those are the two books in the New Testament written by a contemporary of Paul. He was a historian and physician by the name of Luke, and he also writes in a very chronological way, which gives us a tremendously accurate understanding of how these things played out. The Gospel according to Luke is all about the life of Jesus, and then the Acts according to the apostles from Luke talks about the birth of the church right after the resurrection of Christ, and then about the next 30 years approximately of what happened. And that's why in the book of Acts, chapter 15, you read about the very first meeting of all of the apostles and elders at the Church of Jerusalem to wrestle with an issue of truth and the gospel, and they called that a council. And this is what he's referring to, okay? Let's back on track, verse 2. And it was because of a revelation that I went up, and I submitted to them the gospel which I preached among the Gentiles. But I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear I might be running or had run in vain. So what Paul's saying here is he's going, I first talked to them in private because I wanted to make sure I was on track and I had not been, investing in something that I misunderstood. Verse 3, but not even Titus, who was with me, thought, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Now, what the Judaizers were teaching is, well, you got to be Jewish, and if you're going to believe in Jesus, and guess what else? That means you're going to have to get circumcised, right? Which is, it's kind of a big leap for an adult male, if he wants to become a follower of Christ. That you could call that a hindrance to the gospel, so to speak, for adult males. And Paul says, well, Titus didn't feel compelled. And what he's trying to say here is that the gospel is not compelling people to do this. Verse 4, but it was because of the false brethren, these are the Judaizers, who had sneaked in to spy on our liberty with which we have in Christ Jesus in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel might remain with you. But from those who were of high reputation, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality anyway. Well, those who were of reputation contributed nothing to me. On the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter or Cephas had been to the circumcised, for he who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised effectually worked for me also to the Gentiles. Now notice what he's saying. He's saying that I was called to this group, Peter was called to that group, but it was the same Holy Spirit, it was Christ who was working through us effectually, bearing fruit. Verse 9, and recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas, or Peter, and John, who reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. They only asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do as well. So, little nutshell. Paul points out that the gospel he gave to the Galatians is agreed to be the authentic gospel by all the apostles, and he even name drops when he says Peter, James, and John. So it's not just the leadership at the Church of Jerusalem, where the church started. It's not just the apostles, but it's also the well-known apostles that were going and preaching to the Jews, okay? Now, this is the principle here that I think is very important that we see Paul outlining here in the first 10 verses of chapter 2. And that, let me give you the context and the principle. Here's a basic context. Paul became a follower of Christ in a very dramatic way. He spent a significant period of time learning, growing, training himself in his newfound faith. Then he was sent out by the church in Antioch, not by human hands, he says, but by the calling and anointing of the Holy Spirit. And he was asked to go and plant churches based on his newfound faith. He focuses specifically in this letter that he wrote on the proclamation of what he was preaching. This is the exact nature of the propositional truth that I was proclaiming. And so what he's saying is that my proclamation of the gospel was a truth claim. It was a truth claim. Now, this is very important because when it comes to being pressured to conform to the world, the primary way in which the world tries to pressure you is through its own truth claims. And Paul is saying, don't be influenced by the truth claims of this world. And so the implication here is very clear. Paul is saying, I'm not trying to start a new religion. I'm not trying to make you abide by a whole new set of rules, and I'm not trying to recruit you into becoming Jewish. What I'm trying to do is proclaim a brand new truth claim, and this is so different than a religion. Let me try to dig into that and explain. Because what Paul is claiming the gospel is it's a metaphysical claim about ultimate reality. You're like, okay, those are some big words. Well, what I'm trying to get at, what I want you to understand this is he's basically saying the world works differently than religions tell you it works. Now, you have to understand at this time, religions were pretty much the only option other than philosophy for any intellectual. Sciences were fairly undeveloped at the time. Mathematics, in some ways, was being developed, but it wasn't being developed as much as philosophy. I mean, most of our writing from this time that's outside of the biblical canon or library, the word canon means standard, is simply mostly about philosophy. So very important to understand that. And so what he's doing is he's saying, I'm making a philosophical claim that counteracts all the Greek philosophy, and it also, though, counteracts religion, because philosophy and religions tended to kind of be, I guess you would say they're like the rails of a train, right? They ran parallel to each other, but they never really influenced each other, except for in the Roman elite, which there was philosophy, and then there was, the polytheistic gods of the Godhead. So let me kind of connect the dots here for you. Paul wasn't trying to start a new religion. What he was trying to do is say, here is the truth about why human beings actually exist. This is why you are on this earth, and it's not what religions and the Roman gods say it is. Number two, he was claiming he knew what the ultimate problem with human beings truly is in this thing called life. He was saying all of our struggles, all of our pain, all of our suffering, all of our confusion, and all of our lack of direction and our sense of meaninglessness. He says all of our difficulties, struggles, hurt, and suffering and pain are all tied to one thing. And if you understand what that one thing is, then that unlocks the door in order for you to experience joy, hope, faith, and love. He was claiming that one thing was Jesus and Jesus Christ alone. He says this is where we find the answer to the deepest questions of our soul. It is Jesus where we discover the truth about this reality in which we live. It's in Jesus we discover life. And so after that, a small group of people, also known as Judaizers, and here he calls them false brethren, which I think is really interesting, meaning they weren't really brothers in the community or the Christian community. They were false. He says, they come in after him and they make this claim, well, what Paul's saying is not really true. It's not accurate. What is true is that you need to be Jewish in order to experience all of this redemption, joy, hope, faith, and love. So this was an epic struggle early on in the church. It was an epic struggle. And this is why the second rule of life is don't be conformed by the world. Oftentimes, if you discover the first rule that he lays out, that is, grab a hold of the gospel and understand your true purpose in life, the second rule is the world, even people who call themselves Christians, are going to come in and try to influence you away from the simplicity of devotion to Jesus. So, never be conformed by the world. And the way you need to do that is read the Bible. And remember, the Bible was written for you, but it wasn't written to you. So you have to seek the principle that is being laid out to the people it was written to in order that you can apply it for your own life. So let's dig into this a little bit deeper. He uses the word here, kind of this concept of conform, all right? So if you go through the New Testament, you see this word pop up, 6 or 7 different times, maybe fewer than that. And there are two interesting words used which have totally different derivations or roots from where they come. In Romans 8:29, it says, do not be conformed to the world. In Philippians 3:10, it says we should be conformed to Christ. So that word comes from a Greek word, symorphos. And symorphos is like molded into, like morphed. We use that word morphed, and that's kind of where that word comes from. And sim, we get the word like, it's a kind of a root connected to the word similar. So it's saying there is an image and you're being molded into that image. So it's a process of growth and shaping and working, just like a potter works clay to get it into the form it needs to come. And then there is another word in Romans 12:2 where it says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. And then Peter, the apostle, uses the same Greek word in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 14. And it is the word syschematizo. So syschematizo. And what's interesting is the center of that word is like schematic, right? So it's like a blueprint of where the world wants you to go. And so in Romans 12:2, he goes, don't follow the blueprint of the world. And what does this basically mean? These two words and their usage and Paul's statement here in the first 10 verses of chapter 2. Well, it means simply this. There is an influence. There is a schematic. There is a pull in this world that is going to tug on you. And it's going to tug on you your entire life, right? Sometimes we call that temptation. Sometimes we call that, wrong thinking. Sometimes we call that unbelief. There's a lot of different words we use to try to describe this underlying pull. What I want to get at is just the simple truth is that there is one, and it will continue to tug on you until you move on to glory. So what is so important to know about this tug, and why is it so important for it to not be allowed to tug on you? So you want to lessen this pull as much as possible, because that is the second rule for a successful pursuit of life. Well, let's dig into that right now and apply what he just said a little bit, okay? Number one, there is always a pressure to conform to the world in your life, and people always want to change the point and purpose of the true gospel message in regards to your life. So standing firm is basically holding to the simplicity of devotion to Christ, right? It's very important. I have some good friends, some relatives visit about a week or so ago, and they're from Europe, and they've lived their whole adult lives over there in Europe. And we're chatting about how things are so different in Europe, and I shared a story with them of how my wife, Kim, she has family that are from Denmark. And so a few years ago, before she got ill, we took our kids and we went over to Denmark to visit some of her distant relatives. And when we got over there, it was a wonderful, wonderful trip. When we were there, we went down and we met these folks, and they live in this town, and they gave us a tour of this little tiny village right there on the water. And we met their extended family and saw where they work. And what's interesting is the one gal, she was pretty old. She was in her late 80s, and her son, who was my age, about 60, he was showing us around. And we went back to her little apartment where she's lived most of her life in this little town. And we were talking about, she was trying to ask questions. She speak Danish, she didn't speak English, but her son was bilingual. And so she was asking all these questions. Well, what exactly do you do? What did you exactly do? And at this time I was in the full-time ministry. I said, I'm a pastor. And she was like, oh, so you basically work for the government. And I said, which started to really, it just really revealed to me how different people view things like Christianity in Europe than we do over here. And I said, well, no, I don't work for the government. I don't work for a denomination. I don't work for anything. And so she was really struggling with that. She goes, well, don't you collect taxes? And she was still paying taxes. All Danish people do to the parish or the barrio or whatever from the local church that they are in. Now, they don't pay a lot. It's just a little bit each year. And I said, well, why do you pay that? And she goes, well, you need to have some place to be buried. So people are paying tax because if you want a plot to be buried somewhere, the only way to do that is by being buried in the church cemetery, which is basically owned by the state because it's a state church. So I just found that all really fascinating. But the point of my story is this, is she says, well, I don't understand what you do then. And so we talked, and finally she goes, oh, and she said something, and he translated and said, oh, so you're a free church. And I looked at Kim, and she smiled at me. And I said, I don't understand. She goes, oh, free churches, they don't get any money from the government. They operate only on their own. They don't have any, like bureaucracy around them. And she says, I went to a free church once. She says, oh, I loved it. The music was just gorgeous. It was beautiful. And so she was like, oh, so over there, what we do here seems to them what they call free, and it's more of an artistic expression. Which in Europe, the arts are much more celebrated there than they are here. So we were talking about this, my relatives from Europe, of how organization and bureaucracy has such a negative effect on faith. And bureaucracy and organization in the church has done more to harm the preaching of the gospel and people's attempt to understand it, embrace it, than anything else. And that is all a result of the pull, you see, and that is all a result of the influence of the world trying to come in and change the gospel. As soon as you have an authentic experience with Jesus Christ, there will be people who try to take advantage, manipulate, control, or influence that. This is why I'm doing this, the Salty Pastor. I am not beholden to anybody anymore. And I am not being influenced. I'm not being coerced. I'm not being asked. I don't have to go to any meetings where people tell me they don't like what I'm doing. I don't have people threatening me to, well, we're going to leave your church if you don't do this. I don't have people accusing me of false things all the time, which, by the way, when, that's the number one issue that pastors have to deal with in the world today, and why so few people want to be pastors. More pastors are leaving the ministry than ever before. And you ask them why, all surveys say this, it's all because of the politics. And one of the biggest things about politics is people come in and they try to get what they want and they accuse you of false stuff all the time. It happens all the time. And so you're going to experience that in your own life when you start thinking about the Bible and when you start thinking about Jesus. And I just want to encourage you, don't ever let that win. What's happening in you, your journey of faith, is the most wonderful, beautiful thing that's happening in your life. Your discovery of who you really are and the reason why you are on the planet Earth and who Jesus is and what he wants to do in you is the most joy-filled, redemptive, healing, transformational experience of your life. Every guy I know who's had an authentic confrontation with Jesus has never been the same. They start to understand what it means to be a real man, how you're called to be strong, how you're called to be a defender, you're called to be a warrior, you're called to stand against the evil in this world, you're to be a light of righteousness to the lost, but you're also called to be tender and gentle with those who are weak. You're to protect, not destroy. You're to lift up, not tear down. You're to encourage, not discourage. Man, every guy who experiences that, and then they go to church and they get freaking ruined, right? They get all this stuff heaped on them. And what they start to realize, and this is a really salty take, and I believe this, is that the church has been feminized and their woman wants them to go because it becomes a control mechanism on them. It's really hard to be a man's man in a church today. And so I just want you to know that is a result of this tug and this pull. Is it because churches are bad? No. Is it because people, are nefarious or immature? No. I'm not saying that all about leaders in churches. What I am trying to say, though, is this, is that there is a nomenclature, there is a bureaucracy in there, and I believe overall, no matter what, people respond to incentives. And then one of the sad things about being in Christianity in America today is that everybody spiritualizes why what they do. Perfect example is on COVID. Perfect example is on COVID. I can't tell you how many churches that I knew shut down during COVID. Now, why did they shut down? Well, because they didn't have a choice, right? They just didn't have a choice. And you say, well, yes, they did. Okay, well, listen to what I'm saying. A lot of them didn't have a choice because they're renting movie theaters or they're renting schools. No, if you're a church and you're portable and you're renting a movie theater, you're renting a school, or you're renting an event center, and the event center, the school, or whatever says, sorry, we're locking the doors and we're not letting you in, they don't have any choice, right? They don't have any choice. So, okay, so they're in that situation. I don't have a problem with that. Say, okay, well, the church is not a building. It's not a location. It's a group of people. It's a community. So we're just going to retool and go in a different direction. But what I found so interesting is churches that did have buildings or churches that were in schools and they got locked out, put out things that said, well, the Lord told us because of the safety and compassion for everybody else that we needed to not meet together. Well, I'm sorry, but that's just a bunch of hooey because the scriptures don't teach that, right? The scriptures teach that the church is a community. It's not a building, and it needs to operate. So do I have a problem with the church saying, well, we're not going to gather for a while? No, not at all. But it's the pull, it's the incentive of the world that gets us to do things and then spiritually rationalize it. And people do this all the time. And this is, if I may be so bold, what I have found in my own life and in the lives of a lot of people, particularly people who grew up as Christians and Christian families, is that they make decisions and then they put God's name on it all the time. They rationalize it instead of actually seeking in humility what the Lord is leading them to do. And that's a problem. And that's a problem in the world today. Now, I'm telling you this because I don't want you to be negatively influenced by this pull. Don't ever let the world creep into tugging against your faith and what God wants to do in your life. And what he wants to do in your life is that he wants to redeem you. He wants to heal you. He wants to restore you. He wants to make you whole. He wants to infuse your life with meaning and purpose and direction. He wants you to walk in ways that you never imagined. He wants you to experience joy you never imagined. He wants to do exceedingly and abundantly beyond anything you could ever create up in your own mind about how your life could be. All right, I'm going to leave off here, and we're going to apply this biblical principle more on our Thursday podcast. And so I hope that you dug into this, you understand it better, and I'd love for you to sign up for our weekly inspirational blog that we email directly to you. You can go to our website, and you can just sign up for it right there, and it will come directly to your inbox. Be sure to go into your contacts and add it so it doesn't get kicked off. Or sent to the junk file. Also, if you are there on our website, click on that donate button and become a regular supporter because this is 100% supported ministry. So God bless you, and always remember, think for yourself.